Maraming salamat po, Attorney Danielle. Good morning, everyone. Morning. It's, I think, a very invigorating morning. And before I begin my discourse, I'd like to acknowledge my fellow distinguished participants in this forum. And may I first, of course, greet Professor Leo Batad. Good morning. Representative Edsel Lagman, one of our nation's staunchest human rights advocates, especially among those working from within the public service, and how I wish that all members of the House are of the same caliber and integrity than him. Attorney Jasmine, as the representative of our dear Vice President Leni Robredo, distinguished members of the panel of reactors, I was about to say panel of prosecutors. Subliminally, I kept thinking about all those cases, those trumped-up charges now pending before the DOJ. So to Dean Chel Jose Manuel Jokno, Dean Chel Jokno, who in his own enduring and unconditional commitment to the defense of human rights has more than lived up to and is in fact part of the very legacy of his esteemed father, Senator Jose W. Jokno. And Dean Chel here happens to be my lawyer representing me in my cases, including the habeas data petition. A groundbreaking one, hopefully, testing the doctrine of parliament of a presidential impunity. The ever very competent and dedicated Commissioner, CHR, Karen Gomez Dumpit, whom I have known since I was CHR chairperson and who is until now tirelessly continuing the dedicated work she has been doing in the CHR. Karen was actually my mentor in my maiden months as CHR chair. The ever reliable and conscientious PPA administrator, Manuel Co. Dr. Grace Gorospe Hamon, Attorney Pura Ferrer Calleja. Is Attorney Calleja here? Magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat muli, fellow human rights advocates and defenders, students, members of media. Magandang umaga po. I thank you for the invitation, for it is truly a great opportunity for me to be here today to express my views and my solidarity with those who stand against the death penalty, and more importantly, for those who defend the sanctity of life. If I ask everyone this morning, what do you think is a person's greatest weapon? Would your answer his or her knowledge, power, wealth, influence? If you do answer one of those, you're not entirely wrong, but I have a different take on that question. All of those are weapons, but they are useless without one thing: a person's identity. Without that self-awareness, a person can have no sense of purpose. Without an identity and a sense of purpose, what use is his or her knowledge, power, wealth, or influence? They are but aborted potentials that go to waste, for they are not put to use effectively, efficiently, or meaningfully. A waste of potential, a waste of life. When people know who they are and what they stand for, there are no chains that can bind them, no walls that can cage them, no fists that can crush them, no water that can drown them, no tanks that can break their ranks if they stand together, arm in arm, no guns that can silence them, and no hole in the earth deep enough to bury them. For even that ultimate sacrifice will echo through time as their ghosts point their accusing fingers of their executioners. But when we can't even see each other for who we are, when we see factions instead of one nation, when we can't agree on common interests, let alone common values, this period of time will pass with nothing to show but the death of the Filipino spirit, along with the death of thousands of possible victims of extrajudicial killings thus far this year. As of December 1, according to PNP, there have been a total of 5,845 of persons killed in connection with the so-called war on drugs since July 1. 2,004 of which are suspected drug personalities supposedly killed in police operations, and 3,841 victims of extrajudicial or vigilante-style killings as of November 30. When we acquiesce to the reimposition of the death penalty, we will not only be signing the death warrant of those who will be killed by judicial fiat or otherwise, we will be signing the death warrant of the Filipino people as a nation. For how can we reconcile sanctioning killing one another in each other's name? People of the Philippines. Thus, that is the question we are here to try to answer today. It is not simply whether we are pro or anti-death penalty. The question is deeper than that. We have to ask ourselves, what is it that we value above all? If we care nothing for the sanctity of human lives and our other inherent and inalienable human rights, so be it. Let us allow our society to descend into the chaos of a no man's land where every person and his or her possession are fair game, where the very act of stepping out of your home is an invitation to be victimized, and there are no expectations of the protections of due process, equal protection, justice, or rule of law. Just every man and woman for ourselves, praying that no one envies or hates them enough to put them on some person's arbitrary hit list. But if there's still a part of us that values our rights and our freedoms, that priceless and precious blessing of democracy, of exercising them without the fear that all those can and will be taken away at the whim of so-called authorities who operate on the basis of unverified accusations, personal vendettas, and as the recent deaths of even high-valued inmates who were already in custody have shown, the intent not so much as to ferret out the truth about illegal activities, but in fact to enter the truth about possible corruption and complicity of favored government authorities in such illegal activities. We must find the willpower and the courage to fight for them. And yes, it is indeed shaping out to be a fight. But no, not to fight that we are called upon to fight with our fists or weapons or even words. It is a fight we must fight in our minds. The fight to resist being psychologically and morally broken down by events until we are mentally and spiritually weakened enough to accept this culture of death that is being forced upon us. Indeed, it is a systematic and egregiously manipulative psychological warfare that is being waged against us, the Filipino nation. Step one, I refer to that psychological warfare. Step one, sow discord and divisiveness among fellow Filipinos, pitting one against the other with the, if you're not with us, you're against us mentality, which ignores the need for meaningful discourse and instead shoots any attempt at one down to hide the weaknesses and fallacies in their own arguments, aided by the rise of a cyber trawling and fake news spreading paid propaganda army. Step 2, spread far among the populace through the publication of unverified drug hit lists that are so notoriously unreliable. They included individuals who are already dead and individuals who are not at all involved in those illegal activities. Step 3, use the war against drugs to sow even greater fear through the unmitigated and even explicitly emboldened use of fatal force against purported drug suspects that has killed not just those suspected of involvement with the illegal trade, but also innocent bystanders, including children and victims of mistaken identity. Step 4, use the war against drugs to slowly chip away the people's expectation of respect and protection for their rights, including through questionable practices associated with warrantless searches and arrests, and further erosion of such expectation by threats of declaration of a national state of emergency and suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. Step 5, revise the history of Philippine democracy by giving a hero's burial to the dictator whose martial law regime saw not just rampant corruption, but also heinous and gross violations of human rights, including thousands of victims of torture, summary execution, and forced disappearances, politically motivated arrests and imprisonment, in an attempt to obscure the line between out-and-out despotism and heroism, thus paving the way for the re-emergence of a similar blight to our democratic way of life. Step 6, a series of disturbing events that appear to be paving the way for the declaration of martial law, but he just called it a stupid, or at least the suspension of the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus, and I know why he called it stupid. All of these things, which by themselves are already far from innocuous, when taken together, attain an even greater level of insidiousness that only hints at the true horror that lies in wait for us. They are intended to slowly but surely break us down, to make us we see death as not just the only workable solution to all of our nation's woes, but even the better one, quote unquote. It is as if they're making us complicit in their crimes by making us accept such an imperfect and truly ineffective, quote unquote, solution as capital punishment is the more acceptable solution than this spate of extrajudicial killings, when extrajudicial killings are even worse than death penalty. And how are they making us accept this? By wearing us down with all the killings that are taking place in our midst on an hourly basis. 1.58 deaths every hour, or 38 deaths a day, to be exact. The more desensitized we are to the death of our fellow human beings, the less shocking these occurrences become, the more accepting we are of judicial killings, perhaps thinking that the latter is the lesser of two evils and hence acceptable to a civilized and democratic society that is supposedly governed by the rule of law. Make no mistake, however, that the revival of the death penalty is nothing more than the veritable desperate last stand of a tired old narcissist who likely realizes that his temperament, skill set, and parochial approach to governance, which includes his own brand of patronage politics and kumpare system, are ill-suited and frankly incapable of finding real and lasting solutions to the problems of the country he swore to serve. Thus, to hide his incompetence and failure, his go-to recourse has been to impose final solutions upon the very people he was entrusted to serve and protect, hoping that we are stupid and naive enough to mistake the body count for real accomplishments. Yet, the primary argument for death fails. It is not a deterrent. To quote Flagg's own primer on the death penalty, quote, "Deterrence is not a function of the penalty's severity, but more a function of the certainty of prosecution and punishment. Very few criminals, if any, consider the penalty in the commission of crimes. What they consider is that they are not caught, and if they are caught, that they can be acquitted. The death penalty does not necessarily determine whether the crime will be committed or not, as there are other factors that come into play, such as need brought about by poverty, environment, education, and values," end of quote. The deterrence effect is not something that will be achieved by slapping the severest punishment on people. It requires effective law enforcement from heightened crime prevention efforts, and if those fail, successful and effective crime detection, investigation, and prosecution. It requires more effort from law enforcers like the police force than just drawing their guns and shooting at criminals point blank. At the very least, the police should know the elements of the crimes they are preventing and investigating, a basic skill that Senate hearings have shown is deplorably lacking in some members of the police force, including high-ranking officials. The fact that our so-called leaders are selling it to us as having such non-existent deterrent effect just goes to show the utter laziness that is infecting our leaders. They would rather kill instead of protect. They would rather risk killing the innocent rather than make the effort to increase police visibility and enhance their investigative prowess. Apparently, that is too much to ask for. I disagree. I firmly disagree. I believe it is possible and it is worth it. That's why I'm not only fighting the several legislative measures pending before the Senate that will bring back the death penalty, I'm actually championing my own alternative bill imposing qualified reclusion perpetua, but also championing other legislative measures that seek to empower, improve, and modernize our criminal justice system to make it more effective and responsive to modern times. Now, if the deterrent effect is a hoax, why then force this upon us? Perhaps, in reality, it is the retributive aspect of it that they're really working towards. But retribution for what? Disturbingly, the motivation to hide incompetence is perhaps the more innocuous reason for reimposing the death penalty if compared to another one. The motivation to suppress political dissent and seek retribution against political opponents. As much as regimes have touted the alleged deterrent effect of capital punishment against the commission of crime or heinous crimes, what they are often actually frighteningly useful for are as weapons for political oppression and suppression. We need only look at our history to see that among the most prominent people who have been sentenced to death are those who have done the most unforgivable of crimes. They fought for the Filipino people's freedom. Andres and Procopio Bonifacio, Jose Rizal, Chief Justice Jose Abad Santos, Wenceslao Vincents, among many others. The death was never as much an effective instrument of justice as it has been a horrifyingly potent weapon for the politically and militarily powerful to wield against those who seek to oppress and subjugate. Even then, however, seeing as how these victims have gone down in history as heroes and martyrs, death has been quite impotent to suppress their ideals, and to this day, people continue to fight for what is right, regardless of the consequences for themselves, as was clearly and heroically displayed during the demonstrations last Wednesday protesting the burial of Marcos at the libingan ng mga bayani. But that doesn't stop autocrats, despots, and unhinged narcissists from trying to stamp out the idealism in us. In other words, the absolute worst part of the systematic psychological pressure cooker our own government is attempting to trap us in is that they see the goodness in our people, and instead of nourishing and making us a better and stronger nation by it, they are manipulating and using our very humanity as a weapon against us. They are dealing the ultimate blow to us as individuals and as a people. They are stealing our identity and robbing us of our sins of higher purpose. They are committing the biggest crime against democracy, impairing their right to self-determination by disabling them from making informed and well-thought-out decisions about their present and their future. It isn't enough for them to rewrite our past. They want us to write our future in our own blood. Before that happens, I ask the people here today, do you still know who you are and what your purpose is? A year ago, I used to know what Filipinos stood for. I knew it if from the fact that when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was being drafted, we not only took active part through our delegation chaired by none other than Carlos Pil Romulo, but our delegate was also credited as evoking the abuses, quote, and worse of the Nazi regime in Germany to argue, quote, forcefully against weakening the Declaration's prohibition of torture by referring to local cultural customs, unquote, saying that, quote, diluting the ban could provide cover for those who cloak their abhorrent practices in cultural justification, end of quote. I knew it from the fact that after decades of suppression under martial law rule, our people came together in a peaceful and bloodless revolution that not only toppled the dictator, but produced a constitution that embodied human rights and social justice. I knew it too when 7 years ago, we were all collectively outraged by a massacre perpetrated by those who thought that power and influence could give them impunity for killing dozens of innocent people in broad daylight, including women and journalists. Now, near the end of 2016, after all the deaths and the still rising death toll, after all the wearying news about impunity and misogyny and lack of accountability for deaths happening under highly suspicious circumstances, to say the least, I ask everyone here if they still know who they are and what they stand for. Who do we seek when we look in the mirror? Are we Filipinos who still believe in the worth of Filipino lives, rich or poor? Or are we part of the faceless executioners hiding behind masks of either authority or anonymity? There are lawyers, media practitioners, human rights advocates, students, and public officials present here today. What identity do you assume out in this world? Are you defenders of the rule of law? Are you fighters for human rights? Or are you among those who are already broken down that you are now prepared to surrender your humanity to those who would not just destroy it, but also use it, destroy others? Are you now just another cog in this murderous machine? Can you still stand up and say that you are not your government? Or are you ready to accept defeat? I know I may likely be preaching to the choir, but that is the crux of the matter, isn't it? If the members of the choir lose their faith, if they lose their identity, who else will go out there and defend the value of human life out in the world? When we speak of people dying, there can be no passive observers. We must take a stand. No to death penalty. No to death. No more killings. Enough with the lazy shortcuts. We want governance from our government, not executioners from butchers. Let justice and the rule of law have its day. Maraming salamat po.
Thank you, good Senator, for those words that we've all thought about and you have put forth before us today. Our next speaker is another personality that needs not be introduced, as he is somebody that we have seen in televisions ever since I could remember.